February 22nd, 1965, 6:47 a.m. Reuben, Big Ruby Carter, 38 years old, 240 pounds of muscle hardened through 15 years as an enforcer in Harlem. As criminal underworld stood outside Bumpy Johnson's brownstone apartment on West 147th Street with hands that would not stop shaking. Carter had killed 7 men during his career, had survived 2 shootings and 3 stabbings, had served 6 years in Sing Sing for manslaughter, and was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who never displayed fear or weakness. But the events he had witnessed 18 hours earlier at the Audubon Ballroom had left him psychologically shattered in ways that ordinary street combat never could. Carter had watched Malcolm X, the man who Carter had been assigned to protect by Bumpy Johnson himself 3 months earlier when Malcolm split from the Nation of Islam and requested security support from Harlem's most powerful crime boss, die on stage in front of 400 witnesses, while Carter stood powerless in the audience, unable to intervene because Malcolm had ordered all of Bumpy's men to stand down 2 weeks before the assassination. Carter knocked on Bumpy's door with a force that rattled the frame. The door opened after 30 seconds. Bumpy Johnson, 59 years old, wearing a silk smoking jacket over pressed slacks despite the early hour, examined Carter's face with careful attention, taking in the bloodshot eyes, the trembling hands, the disheveled appearance. Bumpy stepped aside without speaking and gestured for Carter to enter. The 2 men walked through a hallway decorated with photographs of Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s and into a study lined with bookshelves containing volumes on philosophy, history, military strategy, and poetry. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of cognac from a crystal decanter, handed one to Carter, and waited for the younger man to speak. Carter drank the entire glass in one swallow and said the words that Bumpy had been expecting to hear since he learned about Malcolm's assassination from a radio broadcast at 4:15 p.m. the previous afternoon. "I was there, Bumpy. I saw everything. They killed him exactly the way we told Malco they would kill him if he dropped his security. 3 shooters, shotgun, and 2 handguns. Distraction in the audience. Perfect execution with no possibility of escape. We warned him for 2 months that this was coming. We begged him to let us stay close, and he told us to leave because he didn't want anyone thinking he needed gangsters to protect him." Carter's voice broke and he stopped talking. Bumpy refilled Carter's glass without commenting. Carter drank half the second glass before continuing. "You sent me and Lewis and Henderson to provide security starting in November, when Malcolm asked for help after he split with Elijah Muhammad, and the nation started making death threats. We did our job perfectly for 3 months. Malcolm was never alone, never vulnerable, never exposed. Then 2 weeks ago, February 8th, Malcolm called a meeting and told us that people were criticizing him for having criminal bodyguards, that it was hurting his credibility as a religious leader, that he appreciated our service, but he needed us to stop. Henderson tried to argue that his life was more important than his image. Malcolm insisted. He said he had faith that God would protect him and that he could unbuild a movement based on moral authority while hiding behind men who made their living through violence." Bumpy walked to the window overlooking 147th Street, where early morning traffic was beginning to build. He stood with his back to Carter and spoke without turning around. "You stayed close anyway. You went to the Audubon yesterday even though Malcolm told you not to." Carter nodded. "I couldn't stay away. I bought a ticket like a regular audience member, sat in the back where Malcolm wouldn't notice me. But the real reason was I knew something was going to happen. The threats had been too specific, too detailed, too consistent. People from the nation telling him his head needed to be cut off. People calling Betty saying Malcolm was as good as dead. People firebombing his house 1 week before the speech. You don't survive in this business without developing instincts about when violence is coming. And every instinct I had was screaming that Malcolm was going to die if we were there." Carter finished the second glass and set it down more carefully this time, the alcohol beginning to steady his hands. He walked to the window and stood next to Bumpy. "I got to the Audubon at 2:15 p.m., 45 minutes early. The first thing I noticed was there was almost no security. Usually at Malcolm's events, you'd have Nation of Islam security checking people, patting them down for weapons. Yesterday there was nobody. People just walked in. No searches. No questions. I immediately knew this was wrong. I looked around for Lewis and Henderson. They weren't there. Later, I found out they had been arrested that morning on bullshit parking ticket charges, held at the precinct for 6 hours, and released at 5 p.m., 2 hours after Malcolm was already dead. Convenient timing, don't you think? Bumpy turned from the window and faced Carter directly for the first time, his expression revealing nothing but his eyes, showing recognition of the implication. Police arresting Malcolm's security detail on minor charges hours before his assassination suggested coordination between law enforcement and whoever planned the killing. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment Malcolm took the stage. Carter closed his eyes and replayed the memory that would haunt him forever. Malcolm walked onto the stage at 3:05 p.m. The audience was maybe 400 people, mostly black Harlemites, who supported Malcolm's new direction. Betty was in the front row with their 4 daughters. Malcolm looked calm, confident. He started his usual greeting, "Assalamu alaikum," and people responded. Then, maybe 30 seconds after he started speaking, a commotion broke out. About 10 rows back, 2 black men started arguing, one yelling, "Get your hand out of my pocket," like someone was picking his pocket. Everyone's attention, including Malcolm's and his few remaining bodyguards, turned toward this disturbance. Malcolm tried to calm the situation, telling everyone to be cool, to settle down. Carter opened his eyes and looked directly at Bumpy with rage and grief. The distraction lasted maybe 15 seconds, just long enough for 3 men to move into position. A black man in his early 20s, wearing a dark suit, rushed toward the stage from the side aisle. He pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and blasted Malcolm in the chest from less than 10 feet away. The shotgun blast knocked Malcolm backward over the chairs behind him. Before anyone could react, 2 more men charged the stage, both carrying semi-automatic pistols, both firing as they ran. They stood over Malcolm's body and shot him repeatedly, emptying their weapons into a man already dying from the shotgun blast. I counted at least 16 more shots. The whole thing, from distraction to final gunshot, took less than 90 seconds. Then the 3 shooters tried to escape. One of them, the shotgun shooter, got caught by people in the audience, who beat him severely before police arrested him. The other 2 escaped in the chaos. Carter's voice had become flat and emotionless as he described the mechanical precision of Malcolm's execution. Bumpy returned to his desk and sat down in the leather chair he had occupied during countless meetings with Harlem criminals and politicians and businessmen. He opened a drawer and removed a leather-bound notebook. He wrote several notes about the details Carter had provided, focusing on the timing of Lewis and Henderson's arrest and the coordinated distraction. After several minutes, Bumpy looked up at Carter and asked the question that would determine how Harlem responded. "What do you want me to do, Ruby? Why are you here at 6:47 in the morning instead of at home? You came here because you want something from me. Tell me what you're asking for." Carter stood in front of Bumpy's desk with the posture of a soldier reporting to a commanding officer. "I want you to do what you've always done when someone kills one of our people. I want revenge. I want the people who killed Malcolm X to die the same way they killed him, publicly and brutally. I want the Nation of Islam members who pulled the triggers hunted down and executed. I want the police officers who arrested Lewis and Henderson on fake charges to have accidents. I want Elijah Muhammad to understand that ordering Malcolm's death was the biggest mistake of his life, and that he'll spend whatever time he has left looking over his shoulder waiting for retribution." Carter's voice rose as he spoke. "You avenged your brother, Willie, when the Klan burned him alive in 1923. You killed 7 white men in 3 days, and the FBI walked away. You've avenged every insult, every betrayal, every act of disrespect for 40 years. Everyone in Harlem knows that Bumpy Johnson does not forgive and does not forget. Malcolm X was your friend since the 1940s, when he was Detroit Red hustling on these streets. You protected him when the nation started threatening him. He was under your protection, even if he officially told you to stop providing security. His death is an insult to you personally and an insult to Harlem. If you don't respond, if you let Malcolm's killers live and prosper, then what does that say about your power? What does that say about whether Bumpy Johnson is still the man we thought he was, or whether you've gotten old and soft and afraid?" Bumpy listened, without interrupting, his face revealing nothing. When Carter finished and stood breathing heavily, Bumpy spoke in the same calm, measured tone. "Sit down, Rubigo. You're going to listen to something that might be the most important thing you'll ever hear from me. Something that goes against everything you think you know about how I operate. Carter sat, confusion replacing anger. Bumpy continued. You're absolutely right that I've spent 40 years avenging every wrong. Willie's death in 1923 taught me that the law would not protect us, that we had to protect ourselves. That power came from violence. Every lesson I learned after that reinforced the same principle. When Dutch Schultz humiliated me in 1934, I killed 12 of his men in 5 days. When Detective Reardon tried to frame me in 1952, I destroyed his career. When the KKK burned Willie, when racist bartenders refused service, when landlords tried evictions, when Genovia sent 15 men to ambush me, I responded with overwhelming force. You know all of this because you've worked for me for 8 years. Bumpy stood and walked to the bookshelf where he kept his most treasured volumes. He pulled down a worn copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X and held it, staring at Malcolm's photograph on the cover. Malcolm spent the last year of his life trying to teach me something that went against everything my experience had taught me. He argued that the violence I used to maintain power in Harlem was ultimately self-defeating, because it reinforced the stereotypes that white America used to justify oppressing us. He said that as long as black leaders like me relied on criminal enterprises and gang violence, we would never build the political and economic institutions that would give us real power. He said real power came not from the gun, but from organization, education, international solidarity, moral authority. I didn't agree with him. I told him that moral authority meant nothing without the threat of physical violence, that white America only respected black people willing to fight back, that his philosophy would get him killed. Bumpy set the book on his desk. I was right that his philosophy would get him killed. He is dead at 39 because he refused to maintain the kind of security that would have made assassination impossible. He is dead because he believed God would protect him, and that dying as a martyr would accomplish more than living as a compromised leader who relied on gangsters. He made a choice to prioritize principles over survival, and that choice cost him his life yesterday. But here's what you need to understand, Ruby. Malcolm was also right about something I've been too stubborn to acknowledge until now. The violence EV used for 40 years has ultimately failed to change the fundamental conditions that make violence necessary. I killed 7 white men after Willie died in 1923 and sent a message that Harlem would untolerate Klan terrorism. But did that stop the Klan? Did that eliminate racism in New York? Did that create the kind of power that would have prevented Willie from being vulnerable in the first place? No. It made me feel better. It satisfied my need for revenge. It demonstrated that I was not powerless, but it didn't change the system. Bumpy walked to the window again and looked out at Harlem. Malcolm understood what I was too invested in my own methods to see clearly. Real change, lasting change that would prevent future Malcolms and future Willies from being killed, required building institutions that could challenge white supremacy through political organization and economic development and international alliances, not through gang violence that white America could dismiss as proof that black people were lawless and dangerous. When I avenge Malcolm's death by killing nation members and corrupt cops, what will that accomplish? It will satisfy my anger. It will demonstrate that Bumpy Johnson still has power. But will it advance the movement Malcolm was building? Will it create the kind of society Malcolm envisioned? Or will it just reinforce the cycle of violence that Malcolm spent his last year trying to transcend? Carter interrupted, voice rising with frustration. So you're going to do nothing? You're going to let them kill Malcolm and walk away because Bumpy Johnson suddenly decided revenge is wrong and we should turn the other cheek? That's not who you are. That's not what you've taught everyone who works for you. You're the man who said respect comes from defending yourself and that people only take you seriously when they know you'll destroy them if they cross you. Bumpy turned from the window and faced Carter with an expression that combined deep weariness with absolute resolve. I'm not doing nothing, Ruby. I'm doing something harder than revenge. Something that requires more courage than killing people. Something that Malcolm would want me to do if he could speak from the grave. I'm choosing to let Malcolm's death transform the way I think about power and change. I am choosing to believe that Malcolm was right when he said the path of violence I've walked for 40 years, while understandable and sometimes necessary, ultimately leads nowhere except to more bodies and more trauma, and more reasons for white America to fear us. Instead of respecting our humanity, Carter stood up with such force that his chair fell backward and crashed to the floor. You're destroying your reputation. You're destroying everything you've built. When word gets out that Bumpy Johnson refused to avenge Malcolm X, people are going to say you've lost your nerve. They're going to say you're finished. They're going to stop respecting you and stop fearing you. Your enemies will see this as an invitation to come after you. Your allies will abandon you. Everything you've built will collapse because you decided to have a philosophical crisis at the worst possible moment. Bumpy picked up the fallen chair and gestured for Carter to sit. Let me tell you what I've been doing for the past 48 hours, while you've been processing trauma. I've been investigating exactly who was responsible and what kind of response would be possible, given the resources I have available. What I discovered is that Malcolm's death was not a simple hit, ordered by Elijah Muhammad and carried out by a few nation members. The assassination was a coordinated operation involving the Nation of Islam, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York City Police Department, and possibly the Central Intelligence Agency. Multiple federal agencies had Malcolm under surveillance for years. The FBI had infiltrated his organization with informants. The police had undercover officers at his speeches. When the nation decided to kill Malcolm, these law enforcement agencies did not intervene, even though they had advance knowledge. In fact, evidence suggests the NYPD actively facilitated the assassination by arresting Malcolm's security detail on manufactured charges the morning of his speech, ensuring he would be vulnerable. Bumpy opened his notebook and read from notes he had compiled. The shotgun shooter who got caught is named Talmash Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen. He's a nation member from the Newark Mosque, recruited specifically because he wasn't well known in New York. The two who escaped are also nation members, though their exact identities are unclear because they disappeared immediately and are being protected by the organization. But the important thing is not who pulled the triggers. The important thing is who created the conditions that made assassination possible by stripping away Malcolm's security and ensuring law enforcement would not intervene. The FBI's COINTELPRO program has been targeting black leaders for years, trying to neutralize anyone they view as a threat. Malcolm was at the top of their list because of his international connections and his rhetoric about armed assault. The FBI didn't need to kill Malcolm themselves. They just needed to step back and let the nation do it while making sure conditions were perfect for success. Carter sat down again, anger draining from his face as he began to understand the complexity and the impossibility of seeking revenge against an enemy that included multiple federal agencies operating with unlimited resources and legal immunity. So you're saying that even if you wanted to avenge Malcolm, you'd be fighting the FBI and CIA and NYPD in addition to the nation. That's suicide. That's not a fight you could win, even if you mobilized every criminal organization in Harlem. They'd crush you. They'd arrest you on federal charges and send you to prison for life, or kill you and make it look like an accident. You'd accomplish nothing except getting yourself and everyone who tried to help you killed or imprisoned. Bumpy nodded slowly. Exactly right. I could kill Talmash Hayer and the other two shooters if I could find them. I could probably arrange for something to happen to Elijah Muhammad, though that would trigger a war with the nation that would devastate Harlem and kill dozens of innocent people. But I cannot fight the FBI. I cannot fight the CIA. I cannot fight the institutional racism that made Malcolm's assassination not just possible but inevitable once he began threatening the status quo. Bumpy stood and walked to a wall where he kept photographs of important people in his life. There was Stephanie St. Clair, who had first employed him in the early 1930s. There was Frank Costello, who had negotiated the 1946 agreement that gave Bumpy institutional protection. There was Willie Johnson, photographed in 1922, 1 year before the Klan burned him alive. And there was Malcolm X, taken in 1964 after he broke with the nation, showing him smiling and relaxed. Malcolm gave me that photograph 6 months ago during one of our last conversations. He told me he was grateful for our friendship, even though our approaches to fighting racism were fundamentally different. He said he understood why I had chosen the path of crime. And Bjorn said that given the options available to black men in America when I was young, becoming a gangster made sense. But he also said the next generation needed different options, different paths to power that didn't involve breaking the law and killing people. He said his job was to create those new paths, to build institutions that would give black people political and economic power through legitimate means. And he said, my job, if I really cared about Harlem's future, was to support those new institutions, even if it meant acknowledging that my way of doing things was becoming obsolete. Carter listened with an expression suggesting he was beginning to understand. Bumpy continued, when I avenge Malcolm by killing his assassins, I am honoring the old Bumpy Johnson, the man who believed respect came through violence. But I am disrespecting Malcolm's memory and undermining everything he died trying to achieve. Malcolm did not want to be avenged through gang violence. He wanted to be remembered as someone who transformed the civil rights movement by insisting on black pride in self-defense and international solidarity. He wanted his death, if it came, to inspire people to continue building the organizations he created. If I respond to his assassination by killing nation members and corrupt police officers, I am sending the message that Malcolm's vision was wrong, that violence is still the only effective response, that black people should continue relying on criminals like me instead of building the legitimate institutions Malcolm dedicated his life to creating. Bumpy walked back to his desk and sat down, suddenly looking all of his 59 years. I'm making a choice, Ruby. I'm choosing to honor Malcolm by doing what he wanted me to do instead of what I've always done. I'm choosing to let his assassination stand as evidence of how broken this system is. I'm choosing to support the people who will continue Malcolm's work, the organizers and activists building political movements and economic cooperatives, and cultural institutions that can give black people real power instead of the temporary power that comes from controlling illegal gambling. And I am choosing to accept that this decision will cost me reputation and respect and authority among people who measure power by willingness to use violence. Some people in Harlem will think I've become weak. Some allies will abandon me. Some enemies will test me. All of that is true, and all of that is a price I am willing to pay to honor Malcolm's memory, in a way that he would have wanted rather than in a way that satisfies my own anger. Carter sat silently for almost a full minute, trying to reconcile this conversation with everything he thought he knew about power in Harlem. Finally, he spoke, voice quieter now. What do you want me to tell people when they ask what Bumpy Johnson is going to do about Malcolm's death? Bumpy considered the question carefully. Tell them that Bumpy Johnson is honoring Malcolm X by doing what Malcolm would have wanted rather than what Bumpy would have wanted. Tell them that revenge through violence would betray everything Malcolm died fighting for. Tell them that the best way to honor Malcolm's memory is to support the organizations he built, and to continue the work he started, and to raise the next generation of black leaders who will have options beyond crime and violence. And tell them that if they can't understand this decision, if they can't accept that, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to fight. Then they never really understood what Malcolm was trying to teach us. Carter stood to leave. Before he reached the door, Bumpy spoke one more time. Ruby, you asked me what this decision says about my power. You suggested that refusing to avenge Malcolm makes me look weak. Let me tell you what it actually means. For 40 years, I've had the power to kill people who cross me. That's the easiest kind of power. The power that any thug with a gun can exercise. What I'm demonstrating now is a different kind of power. The power to control my own instincts and emotions, even when everything inside me wants to respond with violence. The power to choose a different path, even when that path contradicts everything I've done. The power to admit that maybe Malcolm was right, and that maybe my way of operating needs to evolve if we're going to create the kind of future Malcolm envisioned. That's harder than killing people. That requires more strength than revenge. And that is the kind of power I need to exercise if I am going to honor Malcolm's memory. Carter left Bumpy's apartment at 8:30 a.m. on February 22, 1965, and walked through Harlem streets where people were gathering to talk about Malcolm's assassination. By noon, Carter had met with 7 different people who worked in Bumpy's organization, and to each he delivered Bumpy's message, explaining that there would be no violent retaliation because such retaliation would dishonor Malcolm's memory. The reaction was exactly what Bumpy had predicted, a mixture of confusion and skepticism and anger from people who could not understand how someone known for 40 years as Harlem's most ruthless crime boss could suddenly decide that revenge was not appropriate. Evening. The conversation dividing Harlem was not primarily about who killed Malcolm X, or what the nation's motives were. though those topics were discussed extensively. The conversation that truly divided Harlem was about Bumpy Johnson's decision and what it meant, and whether it represented wisdom or weakness. Some people, particularly older residents, who had known Bumpy since the 1930s and who remembered the countless times he had used violence to protect the community, viewed his refusal to retaliate as evidence that he had lost his nerve. They argued that Malcolm's assassination required a response, that letting the nation kill a Harlem leader without consequences would invite further violence. They pointed to the 7 white men Bumpy had killed after Willie's death in 1923, to the 12 Dutch Schultz soldiers who died in 1934, to the countless other acts of retribution. They asked how Bumpy could abandon that legacy at the moment when it mattered most. They suggested that age had made Bumpy soft, that fear of the FBI had made him timid, that he was no longer the man who had terrorized the Klan and survived for decades in organized crime through sheer ruthlessness. Other people, particularly younger activists, inspired by Malcolm's teachings, viewed Bumpy's decision as evidence of unexpected wisdom and moral growth. They argued that Malcolm had explicitly rejected criminal violence, that he had distanced himself from Bumpy's protection precisely because he understood that relying on criminal enterprises undermined the movement's moral authority. They pointed out that avenging Malcolm through murder would feed into white America's narrative about black people being inherently violent, would provide justification for increased police repression and FBI surveillance. They suggested that Bumpy's decision represented a profound act of self-sacrifice, abandoning the methods that had made him powerful in order to advance goals that transcended personal reputation. They saw it as evidence that even someone as deeply invested in the criminal underworld as Bumpy could recognize when historical circumstances required different approaches. The division in Harlem mirrored larger divisions in the black community nationally about how to respond to Malcolm's assassination and what his death meant for the future. Some activists argued that Malcolm's murder proved the necessity of armed self-defense and militant resistance. Others argued that Malcolm's evolution toward a more inclusive approach during his final year represented the path forward, that building coalitions and legitimate institutions mattered more than gang violence that ultimately reinforced oppression. The argument about Bumpy's decision was really an argument about what kind of power black people needed to achieve liberation. Whether that power came through the barrel of a gun or through political organization and moral authority, Bumpy understood that his decision would have consequences beyond the immediate question of whether Malcolm's assassins would be hunted down. By refusing to seek revenge through the methods he had used throughout his career, he was acknowledging that his approach had fundamental limitations, that 40 years of criminal enterprise had failed to create lasting change. He was admitting that Malcolm had been right about something crucial, that real liberation required building political and economic institutions that could challenge white supremacy through means other than criminal violence. This admission carried a personal cost in terms of reputation among people who measured leadership by willingness to retaliate, but Bumpy had concluded that preserving his reputation through violence mattered less than supporting Malcolm's vision through the difficult discipline of choosing not to fight. In the weeks and months following Malcolm's assassination, Bumpy quietly used his resources to support some of the organizations Malcolm had started during his final year. He provided financial support through anonymous donations. He used his influence with politicians and business owners to create opportunities for young people Malcolm had mentored. He protected activists continuing Malcolm's work from harassment by local criminals. All of this was done quietly, without publicity, because Bumpy understood that his value to Malcolm's legacy came not from being publicly associated with the movement, but from providing practical support that helped the movement survive during a period of crisis, following the loss of its most charismatic leader. The irony was not lost on Bumpy, that he was more useful to Malcolm's vision in death than he had been in life. The conversation that Reuben Carter brought to Bumpy Johnson on the morning of February 22, 1965, debated Harlem, and divided the black community nationally and created debates about power and violence and liberation that would continue for generations. It was a conversation about whether strength meant the willingness to kill your enemies or the discipline to restrain yourself from killing even when you had the power and justification. It was a conversation about whether honoring a friend's memory meant avenging his death according to your own values or supporting his vision according to his values, even when those values contradicted your own instincts. It was a conversation about whether real change came through violence or through institution building, through gang warfare or through political organization, through revenge or through the harder work of creating alternatives to the systems that made revenge necessary. And it was a conversation that neither Bumpy nor Carter could have predicted would become one of the defining moments in Bumpy Johnson's life. The moment when the Harlem Godfather chose wisdom over violence, transformation over tradition, Malcolm's vision over his own pride. Bumpy Johnson died 3 years later on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack while eating breakfast at Wells' restaurant, surrounded by friends who had witnessed every stage of his evolution from street criminal to crime boss to the complex figure who chose not to avenge Malcolm X because he believed that honoring Malcolm's legacy mattered more than satisfying his own need for revenge. His funeral was attended by thousands of Harlem residents, including dozens of police officers stationed on rooftops with shotguns. The debate about his decision regarding Malcolm continued long after Bumpy was buried, with some viewing it as his finest moment and others viewing it as evidence of decline. But everyone agreed that the conversation Reuben Carter brought to Bumpy's apartment on February 22 de 1965 had divided not just Harlem but the entire nation along fault lines that concerned power and violence and liberation and the question of how oppressed people should respond when their leaders are assassinated by systems too powerful to fight through traditional means. And in changing that, understanding it contributed to transformations in black political consciousness that would shape movements and struggles for decades to come.